Welcome everyone. This is Ron Stoffel, your numbers guy with the Numbers Guy show. And today we're going to have a two-part show. The first part is going to be on the basics and overview of Common Core, and then we're going to go into more depth on the second show. The first show, we have a guest with us, Linda Bell. Linda, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'll have Linda introduce herself in just a moment. As a disclaimer, both Linda and I are part of a group called Minnesotans Against Common Core, otherwise known as MACC. And our third guest that we'll have in the second show is also that. So, Linda, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yes, thank you for having me. I have been a veteran public school teacher for 25 years. I'm a mother of two, married, and I've taught at the elementary, middle school, high school, and did some collegiate teaching during my graduate degree, both here in Minnesota and in Florida.
Okay, very good. And also, for everybody to know, Linda is one of the co-founders of Minnesotans Against Common Core, and we'll be talking about that a little bit in this one and more in depth in the second show. So why don't we get into the overview and the basics. Let's talk first about, for everybody at home, the history behind Common Core and how we got kind of to the point here, because it's been a long road. I think it started back in Johnson with 65 with the first education bill and has kind of morphed over the years into that. So if you can maybe talk a little bit about that for a little bit for our audience, and I know you've got one slide too that we're going to be putting up when we get to that.
Yes. Well, Common Core is just the latest iteration in a long line of educational reforms. And it is said that Common Core is nothing more than No Child Left Behind on steroids. It is the same animal as Goals 2000. You may have heard of outcome-based education and all of the reforms that reach back to 1965 in the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This development of reforms is known formally as the Standards Movement, which really began picking up speed in the 1990s. And standards indeed undergird everything in education, although sometimes people say that standards are not very important. But standards are actually the foundation. And so we have come to a point now where we are standardizing the standards, we're standardizing the curriculum, and we are standardizing the tests across the country.
Okay. And then more specifically now on Common Core, it was started by a group of individuals, both inside and outside of government, because I think the Governors Association had something to do with it. We have some private enterprises that have something to do with it, both on the curriculum and the assessment standpoint. And then we had a few educators involved, at least partially, even though we'll get to it, is that they didn't approve of the final product. So maybe we can kind of find out the different groups that are involved in this and maybe when that started and when it kind of formulated into what we have now that is a formalized process and who approved it and how it gets to Minnesota.
All right, I'll do my best with that. This is what drew me into Common Core as an issue. I used to write standards and curriculum for the state of Florida, and I read about how these standards were developed, and this is what concerned me. They were developed by the National Governors Association, which is a trade organization, the NGA, and the CCSSO, which is the Council of Chief State School Officers. And this is basically a trade organization for the commissioners of education at every state level. And additionally, the standards then were written by Achieve, Inc., David Coleman being the architect of the standards, who is not an educator at all. Actually, none of the people, the few, it was 3 or 4 that actually wrote the standards, were educators at all. They are all corporate reformers. And so we had those 3 groups working together. All were funded by the Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with a good deal of money. And these groups hold a historic copyright on the standard. This is very, very different than, for instance, No Child Left Behind 10, 12 years ago.
Right.
The federal government developed a set of flexible standards. that the states could use if they wanted to.
It was optional.
It was optional. But these now are held by 3 groups holding copyright on standards, and these groups are completely unaccountable to the parents, to the people of these states, and only they can amend the standards.
Okay.
So that I found rather concerning right off the bat.
Well, yeah, no, I think that, you know, I think most of us understand that it's at least in Minnesota, we've got independent school districts. So we have at least the perception that our local school districts have at least some input into changes that occur at the state of Minnesota with the standards that we have had previously. Like you talked about before, we have had standards here for at least 20 years or so.
Sure.
But having been involved in school districts, we have input into that. There's panels that are put together. It goes through the legislative process. There are hearings, those types of things, which is completely different where this is put together at a national basis. I'll stay away from federal basis for the time being. At a national basis, and then, I'm not sure if dictated is the right word, but presented to the states, and we'll get into it, maybe this is a good time, as to how this was brought into existence through the Obama administration and the race to the top, because I think that's where kind of the carrot and the stick in my mind started was, we're going to give you this money, but happens to be one of those threads attached to that is Common Core. Is that a proper interpretation of basically?
That's a very fair assessment. Yes, basically the Federal Department of Education is funding these grants,
Okay.
and it is the private trade associations and the nonprofit that is writing the standards and can only change the standards. And so we have Race to the Top, which came through President Obama, and there were 4 main components. The standards reform, which said you had to adopt Common Core, the assessment system that said you had to adopt additional testing systems to test Common Core, a data system which basically said you had to set up a state longitudinal database and collect an increasing amount of data on kids, and then an evaluation system was the 4th major component, which evaluated teachers and principals based on how they are implementing Common Core, based again on test scores and that sort of thing. We also, our state, Minnesota, applied for Race to the Top back with Governor Pawlenty and Commissioner Seagren. They applied for Race to the Top. Part of the reason why we are into Common Core is because you had to accept Common Core before you sent your application in. It was already a done deal, and our state needed funds so badly. I can understand they applied for this federal grant. However, the standards were not even written yet. They had absolutely no idea what they were signing up for at the time that they signed up. And so we were locked into Common Core, but we didn't receive any grant money for it.
The first round.
And most of the country did not receive any grant money. But, so then they came back with the No Child Left Behind waivers, which allowed districts to not be under those restrictions of the No Child Left Behind AYPs. And we did receive money for that grant, which basically had the same 4 major components and more restrictions, actually. And so most states received that grant.
In the second kind of round of
Right,
funding.
correct. Additionally, in 2011, our state was an early, they accepted the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, which was a grant funding basically birth to 5 years old.
Okay.
Of
Early education. Yep.
Early education, measurement data, home visits. That's a whole nother very big topic.
Okay. So if I'm understanding it correctly, we've got kind of portions of Common Core standards, which, and hopefully this becomes, we've got a couple of slides that we'll be putting in on this, but we've got the actual standards, which are the copyrighted piece that this organization now has. Then to implement the standards, we will have curriculum. And then we have people that write curriculum, right? There's a few companies out there, which, if I'm understanding, there's a couple of large ones that seem to be racing toward getting their curriculum to match these standards to be able to provide to all of these schools that are going to need this. Is that correct so far?
Yes, I would say so. And again, these companies have also accepted, you know, millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation and from other groups. And this would be Pearson, the largest textbook company in the world. They have a monopoly, really. McGraw-Hill, Houghton Mifflin, and all of the textbook companies that they own.
Right.
You know, this is
because
hundreds.
the names may not be under that, but they own them under a conglomerate.
They do. And so with that money from Gates and they have gone ahead and rewritten all of the textbooks to be Common Core compliant. So they're... Yeah.
So those are the two major pieces. The other one is the assessments and testing, which, if I'm understanding, also somewhat is tied into curriculum, because if you're going to have standards and you're going to have a curriculum and you're going to test for it, there has to be common threads through that. They may be tighter or looser depending on how the curriculum and the testing is done and how narrow the standards are. Because the standards, from my looking at them, have some broad appeals to them. They have some specifics, but they're more what I would consider to be broader in nature, like standards that we currently have. No matter what the standards are, but at least the basics of it is they are standards that have some latitude for teachers, school districts, and stuff to work under. But if you only have curriculum that has a more narrow focus from, we'll call them two conglomerates that are splitting up the United States, my editorial comment. And then you have testing or assessments companies, which then are testing on a state basis, and then I'm assuming we're looking at it from a national basis to try to compare state to state, that they're going to have to create something that will have some reliability among states. Those companies then are closely aligned, or at least one of them, to Pearson, or not? Is my understanding correct that one of the assessment companies is also closely related? Because there's a couple of assessment companies that are creating this also, that are kind of dividing, or a consortium that's creating it. Is that correct or not? For the assessments and writing the standardized test.
Yeah, all of the assessments are written by one company.
Oh, one company, okay.
The ETS, Educational Testing Service. They are based here in Minnesota. They write the tests for the College Board, the CLEP, the SAT, the ACT.
Okay.
They write all of the tests. They write the tests for the MCA that our children take here in Minnesota.
Currently, okay.
And they also are writing the tests for SBAC, the Smarter Balanced, and for the PARC, Partnership of College and Career Readiness. And so they are the writers of all of the tests. And these others are, it's their product, I guess.
Okay.